I have never seen a man lose color in his face as fast as my son Brandon did that morning. One minute he was screaming at me to get out of his glass office, and the next he was staring at the homeless man standing next to me shaking like a leaf. He thought he was looking at a piece of trash he could throw away. He didn't realize he was looking at the man who could end his entire career with a single phone call. Before I tell you how I took back my empire from my ungrateful son, tell me in the comments if you think family loyalty has a limit. Hit subscribe if you love seeing karma do its work. It all started 2 hours earlier on the number 147 bus heading into downtown Chicago. I am Conrad Sullivan, and at 72 years old, I have learned that the world stops seeing you when your hair turns gray. I could have taken a taxi. I could have called a private car. But I prefer the bus. It reminds me of where I came from before I built the skyline of this city. The bus was crowded and smelled of wet wool and stale coffee. I was sitting near the back, clutching the leather briefcase that held the papers my son was forcing me to sign. Suddenly, the bus lurched to a halt, and the hydraulic doors hissed open. An old man stepped up. He looked rough. His coat was 3 sizes too big and stained with grease. His hands were trembling as he fumbled in his pockets for change. He was taking too long. The driver, a young man with a thick neck and zero patience, slammed his hand on the steering wheel. "Hey, Pops, either pay the fare or get off my bus. I have a schedule to keep." The old man looked up, his eyes wide and watery behind smudged glasses. "I am sorry, son. I know I have $1 here somewhere." He dropped a few pennies on the floor, and they rolled away under the seats. The driver scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at this. Another bum trying to get a free ride. Get off before I call the cops." The old man flinched as if he had been slapped. The other passengers just looked at their phones, pretending not to see the humiliation happening right in front of them. It made my blood boil. I stood up, my knees popping with the effort, and walked to the front. I pulled a $5 bill from my wallet and shoved it into the fare machine. "He is with me," I said, my voice low and steady. "And watch your tone, young man. We are all heading to the same place in the end." The driver rolled his eyes, but he closed the doors. "Whatever you say, Grandpa, just sit down." I guided the stranger to the seat next to me. He smelled of old paper and rain, but he had a dignity about him that the dirt couldn't hide. He looked at me and nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. "My hands aren't what they used to be." "Do not mention it," I said, staring out the window at the gray city streets. "People are in too much of a hurry these days. They forget that one day they will be the ones fumbling for change." The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You are right about that. My name is Lawrence. It is nice to meet the only gentleman left in Chicago. I am Conrad. And do not worry, Lawrence, invisibility is our superpower. They do not see us, so they do not know what we are capable of." We spent the next 20 minutes talking. Not about business or money, but about the cold, about how the winters seem longer than they used to be, about the loneliness that waits in empty houses. Lawrence told me he was heading downtown to check on an investment. I thought he was senile or perhaps dreaming, but I just listened. It felt good to be heard. When the bus finally hissed to a stop at Michigan Avenue, I stood up. "This is my stop, Lawrence." He looked out the window at the massive glass skyscraper looming above us. The Sullivan Tower. The building my company built 30 years ago. The building where my son now worked. "That is funny," Lawrence said, standing up with me. "That is my stop, too. Do you mind if I walk with you, Conrad? I could use the company." I looked at him. He looked like a stiff wind would blow him over. I knew Brandon would be furious if I showed up with a stray, but looking at Lawrence, I saw myself. Just another old man trying to navigate a world that wanted him gone. "Come on, Lawrence," I said, holding the door open for him. "Let us go see the sharks." The revolving doors of the Sullivan Tower spun, with a heavy, silent grace pushing a wave of warm, scented air into our frozen faces. I stepped into the lobby, and for a moment I forgot the cold ache in my joints. The floors were polished marble, so reflective they looked like black water. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, held up by pillars of chrome and quartz. I took a deep breath. I remembered pouring the foundation for this place 30 years ago. I remembered the smell of wet concrete and the noise of the riveters. Now it just smelled of expensive cologne and money. Lawrence shuffled in beside me, his oversized coat dripping dirty rainwater onto the pristine floor. He looked around with wide eyes like a child entering a cathedral, but I noticed his gaze was sharp, scanning the security cameras and the layout of the concierge desk. We had barely taken 3 steps before a woman in a sharp navy blazer stepped into our path. She was young, beautiful, and looked at us as if we were a stain on her carpet. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with polite ice. "Deliveries are around the back. This entrance is for tenants and clients only." I straightened my back, trying to summon the authority I used to command on job sites. "I am not a delivery man," I said firmly. "I am here to see Brandon Sullivan. I am his father." Her eyebrows shot up, disappearing behind her perfectly styled bangs. She looked me up and down, taking in my worn flannel jacket and my scuffed boots. Then she looked at Lawrence, who was wiping his nose with a fast food napkin. "I see," she said, and her tone made it clear she did not believe a word of it. "Mr. Sullivan is in a meeting with the senior partners. I cannot disturb him for personal matters. You will have to wait outside." Before I could argue, the elevator banks at the far end of the hall chimed. A group of men in charcoal suits walked out, laughing and talking loudly. In the center of the group was Brandon. He looked magnificent. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my truck, and his hair was slicked back in that modern style he loved. He was glowing with success, the prince of the castle I had built. "Brandon," I called out, stepping around the receptionist. "Over here, son." The laughter in the group died instantly. Brandon turned his head, and when his eyes landed on me, the smile slid off his face like oil. He stopped mid-stride. His colleagues looked at me, then at Lawrence, and then back at Brandon. The silence in the lobby was absolute and terrifying. For a second, I thought he would come over and hug me. I thought he would introduce me to his friends. Instead, he whispered something to the man next to him and walked toward us alone. His stride was fast and angry. He did not look at my face, he looked at the wet footprints Lawrence had left on the marble. "What are you doing here?" Brandon hissed when he got close enough that only we could hear. "And who is this, my God?" "Dad, you brought a homeless man into the corporate headquarters. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "He is a friend," I said, feeling a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. "We met on the bus. We are just here to sign the papers, Brandon. You told me to come." "Not like this," Brandon snapped, his eyes darting back to his colleagues, who were watching with amused curiosity. "Look at you. You look like you just crawled out of a dumpster." "I am trying to make partner, Dad. I cannot have you parading your charity cases in the main lobby." He grabbed my elbow, his grip painful and tight. He steered us away from the seating area and toward a heavy gray door in the corner marked Service. "Get in there," he ordered, pressing the call button for the freight elevator. "Take the service car up to the 24th floor. Do not get off until you are inside my office. And for the love of God, do not talk to anyone." The elevator doors rattled open, revealing a scarred metal box that smelled of garbage and industrial cleaner. It was the elevator for the trash. It was the elevator for the help. Brandon shoved us gently but firmly toward it. "Go," he said, turning his back on us before we were even inside. "I have to go fix the damage you just caused to my reputation." I stepped into the metal box, pulling Lawrence with me. As the heavy doors rumbled shut, cutting off the view of my son and his shiny world, I looked at Lawrence. I expected him to be angry, but he wasn't. He was taking a small notebook out of his pocket and writing something down with a calm, terrifying focus. "Nice building," Lawrence said softly as the elevator jerked upward. shame about the management. The heavy wooden door to Brandon's corner office clicked shut behind us, muffling the hum of the busy law firm outside. This room was a temple to his ego. The walls were lined with degrees he had barely earned and awards he had bought. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The very skyline I had helped build with my own hands, but right now all I felt was the crushing weight of my son's disappointment. Brandon did not offer us a seat. He paced back and forth behind his massive glass desk, his Italian leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floor like a ticking time bomb. He ran a hand through his gelled hair, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and embarrassment. "You have lost your mind, Dad," he shouted, not caring that Lawrence was standing right there. "You bring a vagrant into my office. Do you know who works on this floor, the managing partners, the investors? If they saw me with him, my career would be over before lunch." He pointed a shaking finger at Lawrence, who was standing quietly by the bookshelf, looking at a first-edition law encyclopedia with mild interest. Lawrence shifted his weight, and as he did, the sleeve of his oversized, grimy coat slid up just a few inches. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Brandon saw it. His rant died in his throat. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute. I watched as my son's eyes locked onto Lawrence's left wrist. I looked too. There, resting against the fraying dirty wool of the coat, was a watch. It was not just a watch. It was a masterpiece of gold and sapphire with a face that looked like a map of the stars. I saw the color drain from Brandon's face. He went from red with anger to a sickly sheet white in the span of a heartbeat. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took a stumbling step back, his hand gripping the edge of his desk for support. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who realizes he has just stepped on a landmine. Brandon knew watches. He spent half his salary on luxury magazines and window shopped for timepieces he could not afford. He knew exactly what he was looking at. That was a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime. It was a watch worth more than this entire building. It was a watch that only a handful of people in the world could own. For 10 agonizing seconds, the air in the room was so thick you could choke on it. Brandon stared at the homeless man with a look of pure terror. His mind was racing. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. Was this a test? Was this man actually someone important? Had he just insulted a billionaire in disguise? Lawrence didn't flinch. He just pulled his sleeve down slowly, covering the gold with the grime. He looked at Brandon with those calm, piercing eyes and smiled a small, unreadable smile. Then the moment broke. I saw the terror in Brandon's eyes shift into confusion, and then finally settle into a sneer of arrogant denial. He let out a sharp, nervous laugh that sounded like a bark. "My God," he said, shaking his head and wiping sweat from his upper lip. "You almost had me there for a second. That is a good fake. Where did you steal it? Or did you buy it in Chinatown with the money people give you for food?" He walked around the desk, his confidence returning, as he convinced himself of the lie. It has to be a fake because the alternative was too terrifying for him to accept. A bum with a $3 million watch. Nice try, old man. But you cannot fool an expert. Brandon sat down in his leather chair, regaining his throne. He pointed at the chairs opposite him. "Sit down, both of you. Let us get this over with before security realizes I have turned my office into a shelter." I looked at Lawrence. He winked at me just once. Brandon thought he was the expert, but he had missed the most important detail. A fake watch doesn't tick with the heartbeat of a history you cannot buy. My son had just looked truth in the face and chosen to close his eyes, and that mistake was going to cost him everything. The silence in the room was shattered by the sound of the heavy office door slamming against the wall. We all jumped. Vanessa stormed into the room like a hurricane wrapped in designer silk. My daughter-in-law was beautiful in a terrifying way. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it cost more than my entire pension for the year, and her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it pulled her eyes into a permanent glare. She held a thick stack of legal documents in one hand and her gold iPhone in the other. "Brandon!" She shrieked, her voice vibrating with impatience. "I have been waiting in the lobby for 10 minutes. The real estate agent is calling me. We need the power of attorney signed now if we want to list the house by Monday." She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw us. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on Lawrence, who was standing quietly by the window. The look of disgust that washed over her face was so visceral, it felt like a physical blow. She wrinkled her nose as if she had just stepped in something foul. "Oh my God," she gasped, taking a step back and covering her mouth with her hand. "Brandon, are you insane? Why is there a homeless person in your office? I can smell the poverty from here. It is disgusting. It is unsanitary. Get him out before he touches something." "Vanessa, please." Brandon started trying to calm her down, but she was already moving. She reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a crystal bottle of perfume. It was Chanel. I recognized the bottle because I had bought it for her last Christmas using the money I saved from skipping lunches. She looked at Lawrence with pure malice in her eyes. "You are contaminating the air," she hissed, aiming the bottle at Lawrence like it was a weapon. "Let me help you with that. You need to be disinfected." She raised her arm to spray him. Lawrence stood still, his back straight, his dignity unshaken. But I could not watch this. I could not let this woman humiliate my friend, a man who had shown me more kindness in 2 hours than she had in 5 years. "No," I shouted. I lunged forward, throwing my body between Vanessa and Lawrence. I was a second too late to stop her finger, but just in time to take the hit. The spray hit me full in the face. It was a thick cloud of concentrated floral chemicals. It went straight into my eyes and up my nose. I gasped, stumbling back. My eyes burned like they were on fire. The sting was immediate and blinding. I covered my face with my hands, coughing as the taste of expensive roses coated my throat. Tears streamed down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the sheer chemical burn. Dad Brandon yelled, but he didn't move to help me. He just stood behind his desk, useless and afraid. Vanessa didn't apologize. She didn't drop the bottle. She actually laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. "Well," she said, looking at me writhing in pain, "at least one of you smells decent now." "Conrad, you look ridiculous. Stop being so dramatic and sign the papers. I have a yoga class at 4. She threw the stack of documents onto the glass desk with a loud slap. They slid across the surface, stopping right in front of my blurred vision. Eviction notice, power of attorney, asset liquidation. The titles were blurry through my watering eyes, but I knew what they were. They were my death warrant. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was steady and warm. Lawrence was there, guiding me to a chair. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his dirty pocket and handed it to me. "Are you all right, Conrad?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I am fine," I wheezed, wiping my eyes. Lawrence turned to look at Vanessa. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were cold as ice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his little notebook again. He uncapped his pen. He didn't say a word to her. He just wrote. I peeked through my swollen eyelids and saw what he wrote. Strike 2. Physical assault. Lack of empathy. He put the notebook away and looked at Vanessa. "You have a very expensive perfume, madam," he said softly. "It is a shame it cannot cover up the smell of your character." Vanessa's jaw dropped. She looked at Brandon, furious. "Did the hobo just speak to me?" she screeched. "Brandon, get security, now, or I am leaving and taking the papers with me." Vanessa crossed her arms and leaned against the windowsill, tapping her foot with impatient rhythm. The scent of her aggression still lingered in the air, masking the smell of fear that was slowly seeping off my son. Brandon sat down heavily in his executive chair, and pushed the stack of papers toward me. The sound of the paper sliding across the glass desk hissed like a snake in the quiet room. "Dad." "We need to be realistic," Brandon said, his voice dropping into that practiced tone he used with clients. "You are 72 years old. You are living alone in that big house. It is too much for you. Last week you forgot to call me on my birthday." "I did not forget your birthday, Brandon," I replied, my voice steady despite the burning in my eyes. "I called you 3 times. You sent me to voicemail." "See," Brandon interrupted, holding up a hand. "You are confused. This is exactly what I am talking about. Early onset dementia. It starts with small things and then one day you leave the stove on and burn the whole neighborhood down. I cannot let that happen. I have a responsibility as your son to protect you from yourself." He tapped his finger on the top document. The bold letters at the top read, "Durable Power of Attorney." I knew exactly what that document was. In my years as a contractor, I had seen dozens of children force their parents to sign this. It was not a protection order. It was a surrender. It gave Brandon the legal right to sell my house, access my bank accounts, and liquidate every asset I owned without my permission. "This gives you total control over my life," I said, looking him in the eye. "It says you can sell my property." "Why would you need to sell my house, Brandon?" "Because we need the liquidity," Vanessa snapped from the window, unable to keep quiet. Brandon shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Look, Dad, the real estate market is crashing. We need to sell your house now while it still has value. We can put the money into a managed trust. We will put you in a nice facility, a place with nurses and activities. It is for your own good." I looked at the son I had raised. I looked at the suit I had paid for. I saw the sweat on his forehead. This was not about my health. This was about money. I had heard rumors from old friends that Brandon was gambling heavily on sports. I heard he owed money to people who did not use lawyers to collect debts. He needed my house to cover his mistakes. "I will not sign this," I said, pushing the paper back. "I am not senile. I am not invalid. And I am certainly not going to let you sell the home your mother and I built." Brandon's face darkened. The mask of the concerned son slipped, revealing the desperate debtor beneath. He stood up and leaned over the desk, casting a long shadow over me. "You are being selfish," he hissed. "You are sitting on a gold mine while your family is struggling. Do you know how expensive it is to become a partner in this firm? Do you know how much a baby costs?" He pointed at Vanessa's stomach. "That is right, Dad. Vanessa is pregnant. You are going to be a grandfather." My heart skipped a beat. A grandchild. It was the one thing I had always wanted, the one hope I had for redemption. "We are having a boy," Vanessa said, her voice suddenly soft and manipulative. "We want to name him Conrad. After you. But we cannot bring a baby into this stress. We need financial security. If you do not sign this paper, you are basically telling us you do not care about your grandson." Brandon leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you walk out of here without signing this, Satad, you will never see him. I will cut you off. You will die alone in that big empty house and your grandson will grow up not even knowing your name. Is that what you want?" It was a knife to the heart. He was holding an innocent, unborn life hostage for a signature. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen he was holding out to me. My hand trembled. Not from age, but from the sheer cruelty of the choice. I loved my son. I wanted to love my grandson. Was my house worth more than my family? I reached for the pen. Lawrence shifted beside me. He didn't say a word. He just tapped his foot once on the floor. A sharp, rhythmic sound. It broke the spell. I looked at Lawrence, then back at Brandon. I saw the greed in his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the baby. He was thinking about the casino. "I cannot do it, son," I said, putting the pen down. Brandon slammed his fist on the table, making the glass shake. "Sign the damn paper, old man, or I swear to God I will have you declared mentally incompetent by force." The heavy glass paperweight smashed against the doorframe just inches from my head as the security guards hauled us into the hallway. I could hear Brandon screaming obscenities behind us, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and panic. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by two old men who looked like they belonged in a soup kitchen. The grip on my arm was tight enough to bruise. The guard, a man with a thick neck and a face of stone, did not care that I was 72 years old. He did not care that I was the father of the man who had just ordered this assault. To him, I was just a disturbance. I was just trash to be taken out. "Easy," I grunted, trying to keep my footing on the polished floor. "I am walking. You do not have to break my arm." "Move it, Pops!" The guard grunted, shoving me forward. "Mr. Sullivan said you are trespassing." I looked over at Lawrence. The other guard had grabbed him by the scruff of his dirty coat, dragging him along so fast his oversized boots were skidding on the carpet. But Lawrence did not look frightened. He looked furious. His jaw was set, and his eyes were darting around, memorizing the faces of the guards, memorizing their name tags. "You are making a mistake," Lawrence said, his voice calm but cold as steel. "You are manhandling a senior citizen. This is a liability lawsuit waiting to happen. I suggest you release my arm." "Shut up, bum," the guard sneered, jerking Lawrence harder. "You are lucky we do not call the cops. Now get in the elevator." They shoved us into the freight elevator again, the same metal box that smelled of garbage. But this time they came in with us. The ride down was silent and suffocating. I rubbed my aching shoulder and looked at the floor. I felt a profound sense of shame. I had built skyscrapers. I had commanded crews of hundreds of men, and now I was being thrown out of my own son's building like a criminal. The elevator didn't stop at the lobby. It went all the way down to the basement loading dock. The doors opened to the smell of diesel fumes and rotting vegetables. This was the underbelly of the tower, the place where the garbage trucks came to collect the waste. Out the guard barked, pushing us onto the concrete loading bay. They marched us past the dumpsters to the heavy steel delivery doors. One of them kicked the bar to open it, and a gust of freezing rain blew in. "Do not come back," the guard said. "If we see you on the property again, you will be arrested. Mr. Sullivan has issued a permanent ban." He shoved me one last time, and I stumbled out into the alley. The pavement was slick with oil and rain. I almost fell, but Lawrence caught my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. The steel door slammed shut behind us with a sound like a gunshot. The lock clicked. We were alone in the alley, surrounded by wet cardboard boxes and the hum of the city ventilation systems. I stood there in the rain, letting the cold water soak into my flannel shirt. My shoulder throbbed. My heart was broken. I had lost my son. I had lost my dignity. And in a few days I would probably lose my home. "I am sorry, Lawrence," I whispered, wiping rain from my face. "I am so sorry I dragged you into this. You tried to help me, and look what happened. They treated you like an animal." Lawrence didn't answer immediately. He was brushing off his coat, straightening his collar with a strange, deliberate dignity. He looked up at the towering skyscraper that rose above us, disappearing into the gray clouds. He looked at the window on the 24th floor, where my son was probably pouring himself a drink and celebrating his victory. "Do not apologize," Conrad Lawrence said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out that strange old phone again. He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw a smile on his face. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf who has just cornered a rabbit. "They treated me like a bum because that is what they saw," Lawrence said. But they forgot to look at the name on the building. He flipped the phone open. "Today was a test, Conrad," he said, dialing a number. "And your son just failed. Now let us go get my car. I hate walking in the rain." The steel door clicked shut behind us, sealing my fate with a finality that echoed in the narrow alley. The sound was like a gunshot, ending the life I thought I had. I stood there shivering as the freezing Chicago rain soaked through my flannel shirt, mixing with the smell of rotting vegetables and wet cardboard. I was 72 years old. I had built half the skyline of this city. I had raised a son. I had been a good man. And yet here I was, standing next to a dumpster in a service alley, thrown out like yesterday's trash by my own flesh and blood. I looked over at Lawrence. The water was dripping off the brim of his dirty hat, running down the deep lines of his face. He looked frail in the gray light. A wave of guilt crashed over me heavier than the rain. I had dragged this poor man into my family mess. I had exposed him to ridicule and violence just because he was kind enough to sit with me on a bus. "Lawrence," I said, my voice cracking, "I am so sorry. You should not be here. You should not have seen that. I failed my son, and now I have failed you too." Lawrence did not look at me. He was looking at his wrist, checking that magnificent watch that Brandon had dismissed as a fake. He wiped a raindrop from the crystal face with his thumb. "You did not fail anyone, Conrad," he said, his voice surprisingly strong against the wind. "You raised a boy. He chose to become a monster. That is on him. But you are right about one thing. We should not be here." Before I could ask what he meant, a pair of blinding white headlights cut through the gloom of the alley. A low, powerful hum vibrated in my chest. A car turned the corner, navigating the narrow space between the brick walls with surgical precision. It was not a police car. It was not a taxi. It was a phantom. A massive black Rolls-Royce with tinted windows that reflected the grim reality around us, making the garbage look like abstract art. The car rolled to a silent stop right in front of us. The back door flew open, and a large man in an immaculate black suit stepped out. He did not look at the trash. He did not look at the rain. He opened a large black umbrella and held it over Lawrence's head, shielding him from the storm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman," the driver said, bowing slightly. "I apologize for the delay. The traffic on Michigan Avenue is terrible." I stared. I blinked, trying to clear the rainwater from my eyes. I looked at the driver, who treated this man in a dirty coat like royalty. Then I looked at Lawrence. The stoop in his shoulders was gone. The hesitation was gone. He stood tall, radiating an aura of power that made the alley feel like a boardroom. "It is quite all right, Arthur," Lawrence said, stepping under the umbrella. "We had some unexpected business to attend to." Lawrence turned to me. I was frozen in place, soaked and confused. He smiled, and this time it was not the shy smile of a stranger on a bus. It was the confident smile of a titan. "Conrad," he said, extending a hand toward the open door of the car, where I could see soft leather seats and a warm golden light. "Please get in. We have a lot to discuss." "But Lawrence," I stammered, pointing at the car. "Who are you?" Lawrence looked up at the towering skyscraper where my son was currently celebrating his victory. He looked at the logo on the side of the building, a stylized falcon made of steel. "My name is Lawrence Falcon," he said simply. "I founded the Falcon Group 40 years ago. I own this building, Conrad. I own the company your son works for. And I think it is time the chairman paid a personal visit to the Human Resources Department." My knees nearly gave out. The man I had defended for $1 on the bus was one of the wealthiest men in America. I looked at his hand, still extended in friendship. I took it. "Get in, Conrad," Lawrence said, pulling me into the warmth. "The war has just begun." The warmth inside the Rolls-Royce was absolute and instant, enveloping me like a heavy blanket. The smell of garbage and rain was replaced by the scent of aged leather and expensive mahogany. I sank back into the seat, my body still shivering from the shock of the cold and the cruelty I had just endured. Lawrence sat across from me. He had taken off his dirty hat, revealing a head of silver hair that was neatly trimmed. He opened a small refrigerator hidden in the armrest and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Drink this, Conrad," he said, handing me the glass. "It is a 50-year-old cognac. It will help thaw the ice in your veins." I took the glass with a trembling hand. The alcohol burned pleasantly on its way down, sending a jolt of life through my numb system. I looked at Lawrence. The transformation was terrifying. The frail old man on the bus was gone. In his place sat a titan of industry, a man whose eyes held the weight of billion-dollar decisions. He reached into a leather satchel next to him and pulled out a thick blue folder. He placed it on the seat between us. The cover was stamped with the logo of the Falcon Group and the words "Internal Audit Confidential." "I did not just come here to test the staff," Conrad Lawrence said, his voice grave. "I came here because of this. Read it." I opened the folder. The pages were filled with numbers highlighted in red. Bank transfers, wire frauds, client escrow accounts that had been drained and replenished in a frantic cycle. And at the bottom of every transaction was a digital signature I knew better than my own. Brandon Sullivan. "He is not getting promoted, is he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Lawrence shook his head slowly. "Promoted. Conrad, your son is the subject of a federal investigation. He has been embezzling funds from the firm for 18 months. He is using client money to pay off gambling debts and fund that lifestyle he rubbed in your face. The only reason he hasn't been arrested yet is because I wanted to see the man behind the numbers personally." I closed the file and looked out the tinted window. The rain was blurring the lights of the city. I felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the alcohol. My son was not just ungrateful, he was a criminal. He wanted power of attorney over my assets, not to invest them, but to fill the black hole he had dug for himself. He was going to sell my house to stay out of prison. "I was going to fire him today," Lawrence continued. "I was going to call the police and have him escorted out in handcuffs. But then I saw how he treated you. I saw him throw his own father into the garbage to save face. And I realized that prison is too easy for a man like that." Lawrence leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "He needs to learn a lesson, Conrad. He needs to feel what it is like to be powerless. He needs to climb to the very top of the mountain just so he can understand how far the drop is." I looked at the folder again. I thought about the grandson that didn't exist, or maybe did exist, but was being used as a pawn. I thought about the look of disgust on Brandon's face when he looked at my clothes. I took a deep breath and finished the cognac. "What do you have in mind, Lawrence?" I asked. Lawrence smiled, and for the first time it was a genuine warm smile. "We are going to give him exactly what he wants. We are going to let him think he has won. We are going to let him think he is the king of Chicago. And when he is sitting on the throne wearing his crown, we are going to show him who really owns the castle." I extended my hand. It was rough and calloused from years of laying bricks. Lawrence took it. His grip was firm. "Let us teach him," I said. Lawrence tapped the partition glass. "Driver, take us to the private hangar. We have work to do." The silence of my empty house was usually my best friend, but tonight it felt like the calm before a storm. I was sitting in my leather armchair nursing the bruised shoulder from the security guard incident earlier that day, and looking at the old photos of Brandon on the mantelpiece. I was wondering how the sweet boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee had turned into a monster who would throw his father into the garbage. I had just hung up the phone with Lawrence, planning our next move, when the front door did not just open, it exploded inward with a deafening crash that shook the floorboards. Before I could even stand up, the living room was filled with blinding tactical lights. Heavy boots stomped across the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like gunfire. 4 men dressed in black tactical gear stormed in. They wore vests that said emergency response, but they moved like mercenaries. They did not identify themselves as police. They did not ask if I was okay. They fanned out, surrounding my chair with tasers drawn. "Conrad Sullivan," a voice boomed from behind the wall of light. "You are being taken into protective custody under the Emergency Mental Health Act. Do not resist." I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. My first instinct was to fight. The Marine in me wanted to disarm the closest man and take control of the room. But I was 72 years old and outnumbered. A fifth man walked in behind them. He was wearing a white coat that looked like a costume and holding a clipboard. "What is the meaning of this?" I shouted, shielding my eyes from the glare. "I am perfectly sane. Get out of my house before I call the sheriff." The man in the white coat stepped forward. He didn't look me in the eye. "We have a court order signed by an emergency judge and your next of kin, Mr. Brandon Sullivan. It states that you are suffering from acute, aggressive dementia and pose an immediate threat to yourself and others. We are here to transport you to the Whispering Pines secure facility." It was a lie so bold it took my breath away. Brandon had not just sued me. He had swatted me. He had hired a private extraction team to kidnap me in my own home under the guise of medical intervention so he could take control of my assets. "I am not going anywhere," I growled, stepping back toward the fireplace and grabbing the heavy iron poker. "This is my property." "Subject is armed and non-compliant," the doctor said, his voice bored and cold. "Restrain him." The men moved in. I swung the poker, but they were fast. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back with professional cruelty until I dropped the weapon. Another kicked the back of my knees, and I went down hard, hitting my face on the rug. I felt the cold metal of handcuffs snapping onto my wrists. "You are making a big mistake," I yelled as they hauled me up like a sack of cement. "My son is lying. This is kidnapping." "Save your breath, Mr. Sullivan," the doctor said, tapping a syringe he pulled from his pocket. "You are confused. You are having an episode. But do not worry. We have a nice padded room waiting for you, where you cannot hurt anyone anymore, especially your son's future." They dragged me out into the night, past the neighbors who were peeking out from behind their curtains, too scared to intervene. As they shoved me into the back of an armored ambulance, I realized this was not about safety. This was a hostile takeover of a human life. Brandon had declared war, and as the doors slammed shut, plunging me into darkness, I swore that if I ever got out of this, I would burn his world to the ground. The room smelled of industrial bleach and old fear. It was a white box with padded walls and a single flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying fly. They had stripped me of my flannel shirt and my dignity, leaving me shivering in a paper-thin hospital gown that barely covered my knees. I sat on the edge of the metal cot, listening to the screams echoing down the hallway. This was not a hospital. It was a warehouse for the unwanted. It was a place where inconvenient parents were sent to fade away into silence. The heavy steel door groaned open. The man in the white coat walked in, flanked by two large orderlies who looked more like prison guards than nurses. Dr. Sterling didn't look like a healer. He looked like a butcher who kept his hands clean. He was holding a small plastic cup filled with 3 bright blue pills. "Time for your medication, Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice flat and bored. "This will help with the aggression. It will help you forget why you are angry." I looked at the blue tablets. I knew what they were. I had seen what they did to the man in the cell next to mine. He spent his days staring at the wall, drooling on himself, unable to remember his own name. This was a chemical lobotomy. Brandon didn't just want me locked up, he wanted me erased. He wanted to turn his father into a vegetable so he could sell my house without a guilty conscience. I felt a surge of panic, but I pushed it down. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I was back in the jungle 50 years ago. I remembered the training. I remembered how to survive when the enemy was all around you. Adapt, improvise, overcome. I let my shoulders slump. I let my jaw go slack. I played the part of the defeated, broken old man. I looked up at the doctor with watery, pleading eyes. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I do not want to take them. They make me feel empty." "Do not make this difficult, Conrad." The doctor sighed, stepping closer. "Or we will have to use restraints. And I hate filling out the paperwork for restraints." I opened my mouth. He tossed the pills in. With a movement faster than thought, I used my tongue to slide the pills into the small pocket of flesh between my lower gum and my cheek. It was a trick I had learned to hide painkillers during the war. I swallowed hard, making my Adam's apple bob theatrically. The doctor grabbed my chin, squeezing hard enough to leave a bruise, and forced my mouth open. He shone a bright penlight into my throat, scanning for the medication. I held my breath, forcing my tongue to stay flat, covering the poison. He grunted, satisfied. "Good boy. See, that wasn't so hard. You will feel much better soon. Just sleep." He turned and walked out, the orderlies following him. The heavy lock clicked shut with a sound of finality. I waited. I counted to 10, listening to their footsteps fade down the corridor. The moment silence returned, I sat up and spit the blue pills into my hand. They were starting to dissolve, tasting bitter and metallic. I crawled to the corner of the room where the padding was slightly torn near the floor. I shoved the pills deep into the foam and smoothed the vinyl over it. I lay back on the hard cot, shivering in the cold air. My body was weak, but my mind was razor sharp. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was drifting off into a chemical fog. But I was wide awake. I was going to watch their routine. I was going to learn their shifts, and I was going to show my son that he had locked the wrong man in this cage. The Marine was back on duty. The chemicals in the wall padding smelled faintly of old sweat and despair, but my mind was clear. I had been counting the guard rotations for 6 hours. Every 45 minutes, the heavy boots of the night orderly would shuffle past my door. He stopped at the vending machine down the hall for exactly 2 minutes. That was my window. I sat up on the cot, my muscles tense and ready. I was not 72 years old tonight. I was 22 again, back in the jungle, waiting for the signal. Suddenly, the buzzing fluorescent light in the hallway flickered and died. The hum of the ventilation system cut out, plunging the facility into absolute silence. The emergency lights bathed the room in a ghostly red glow. It was not a power outage, it was a breach. A low thud echoed from the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor, followed by the distinct sound of a suppressed magnetic charge blowing a lock. I stood up and moved to the door, pressing my ear against the cold metal. I heard footsteps. Not the lazy shuffle of the orderlies, but the precise rhythmic movement of professionals. The lock on my door clicked. It didn't open with a key. It hissed as the electronic maglock disengaged. I stepped back, raising my fists, ready for anything. The door swung open. A figure dressed in matte black tactical gear stood there. He wore night vision goggles and a patch on his shoulder that bore the stylized Falcon logo. He raised his visor, revealing a face that was all business. "Mr. Sullivan," he whispered. "The chairman sends his regards. We are extracting you." I nodded. "Did you bring the package?" The operative handed me a small black pouch. Inside was my old satellite phone and a drive containing the facility's server data. "We are scrubbing their records now, sir. We have evidence of falsified charts, illegal restraint usage, and the bribery payments from your son. But we need to move." The backup generator kicks in 90 seconds. We moved into the hallway. 2 orderlies were already on the ground, zip-tied and unconscious. But as we turned the corner toward the exit, the main lights flared back on. A massive guard, the one who liked to twist arms, stood blocking the double doors. He held a stun baton that crackled with blue electricity. "Hey!" he shouted, charging at us. The operative raised his weapon, but I put a hand on his arm. "No," I said. "This one is mine." I stepped forward. The guard laughed, seeing a frail old man in a hospital gown. He swung the baton at my head. I didn't back down. I stepped inside his guard, pivoting on my left foot. I caught his wrist with one hand and drove my elbow into his solar plexus with the other. The air left his lungs in a rush. As he doubled over, I used his own momentum to flip him onto the hard linoleum floor. He landed with a bone-jarring thud and didn't move. I stood over him, straightening my gown. I looked at the operative, who was staring at me with respect. "I may be retired, son," I said, stepping over the unconscious body. "But I am not expired." We burst through the exit doors into the cool night air. A black helicopter was waiting on the lawn, the rotors spinning silently in stealth mode. Lawrence was sitting in the back, wearing a headset. He reached out a hand to pull me aboard. "You took your time, Conrad," Lawrence shouted over the engine noise as I climbed in. "I was about to come in there myself." I looked back at the grim concrete building as we lifted off, leaving the sirens and the lies far below. I looked at the drive in my hand. It was not just my freedom. It was the weapon that would end Brandon's career. "Let us go home, Lawrence," I said. "I have a funeral to plan." The helicopter ride was a blur of city lights and churning emotions, but the silence of Lawrence's private study was even louder. We were safe now, tucked away in his estate on the outskirts of the city. The room smelled of old books and cedar wood, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic stench of the asylum. I sat in a leather wingback chair holding a glass of water, my hands finally steadying after the adrenaline of the escape. Lawrence sat opposite me behind a massive oak desk. He looked tired. He had saved my life tonight, but he didn't look triumphant. He looked sorrowful. There was a manila envelope sitting in front of him. It was thin, but it looked heavy. "Conrad," Lawrence said softly, pushing the envelope toward me. "My investigators found this while digging into Vanessa's background. We were looking for offshore accounts or hidden debts. We found something much worse." I looked at the envelope. I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. What could be worse than my son trying to commit me to a mental institution? "Is it about the money?" I asked, reaching for the clasp. "Did they sell the house already?" Lawrence shook his head. "It is not about the house. It is about the baby." I froze. My fingers hovered over the paper. The baby. My grandson. The little boy I was going to teach how to fish. The reason I had almost signed my life away. "Open it," Lawrence whispered. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a medical record from a private clinic in Miami dated 5 years ago. I put on my glasses, which the operative had retrieved from my jacket pocket. I read the clinical summary. Patient Vanessa Sullivan. Procedure total hysterectomy. Reason medical necessity due to complications. I read it again, and a third time. The words swam before my eyes. Hysterectomy. That meant the removal of the uterus. That meant she could not carry a child. But I stammered, my mind struggling to process the horror. But I saw the ultrasound. I saw her belly. Brandon touched it. They talked about names. They said they were going to call him Conrad. I reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out a photograph. It was taken by a private investigator just 2 days ago through the window of a changing room at a boutique. It showed Vanessa standing in her underwear. Her stomach was completely flat. On the bench next to her was a silicone prosthetic, a strap-on belly. The air left my lungs. I felt like I had been punched in the chest by a sledgehammer. It was all a lie. Every moment, every smile, every time Vanessa placed my hand on her stomach and said she felt a kick. It was just acting. It was a cruel theater production designed for an audience of one. Me. They knew my weakness. They knew I was lonely. They knew I would give anything to be a grandfather. So they invented a child. They created a ghost to haunt me, and then they held that ghost hostage to steal my money. I dropped the photo. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. The silicone belly looked so real in the picture. "They are monsters," I whispered, my voice breaking. I was not crying for myself. I was grieving for a child that never existed. I was mourning the future they had dangled in front of me only to snatch it away. I realized then that my son was truly gone. The boy I raised would never have agreed to this. He was dead, and this stranger had taken his place. Lawrence poured me a drink. His hand rested on my shoulder. "I am sorry, Conrad," he said. I stared at the medical report. The sadness in my chest was hardening, turning into something cold and heavy like a stone. I wiped my face. I stood up. "Do not be sorry, Lawrence," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Be ready. They used a fake child to destroy me. Now I am going to use the truth to destroy them." The plan was simple, but it was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. To catch a vulture, you have to play dead. I sat in Lawrence's private study, watching the reel-to-reel tape recorder spin slowly on the mahogany desk. My hands were sweating. We were about to make the phone call that would officially end the life of Conrad Sullivan. Lawrence stood by the window looking out at the dark estate grounds. He nodded to his head of security, Arthur, who was holding a burner phone. Arthur cleared his throat, and his voice shifted, changing from a rough bodyguard to a tired, overworked medical administrator. He dialed my son's number. I put on the headphones. I needed to hear this. I needed to hear my son's voice when he found out his father was gone. Part of me, the foolish, sentimental part, that still remembered teaching him to ride a bike, hoped he would cry. I hoped he would scream in denial. The phone rang 3 times before Brandon picked up. "Yeah, make it quick, I am in a meeting." "Mr. Sullivan," Arthur said, his voice grave. "This is Dr. Evans from the Whispering Pines facility. I am afraid I have some terrible news. There was an incident in the isolation ward about an hour ago. Your father went into cardiac arrest." There was a silence on the line. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I waited for the sob. I waited for the grief. "Is he dead?" Brandon asked. His voice was not sad. It was sharp. It was calculating. "The medical team tried to resuscitate him for 20 minutes. Arthur continued playing the part perfectly. "But I am sorry. He did not make it." Time of death was 11:45 p.m. Another silence. Then I heard a sound that chilled my blood. It was a long exhale, a sigh of relief. "Okay," Brandon said. "Look, I cannot come down there tonight. I have a very important gala tomorrow. Just keep the body on ice. And doctor, I need the death certificate faxed to my office immediately. Priority 1. Do you understand?" He did not ask how it happened. He did not ask if I was in pain. He asked for the paperwork. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan," Arthur said. "We will handle the arrangements." Brandon hung up without saying goodbye. I took the headphones off and placed them on the desk. My hands were trembling violently. Lawrence walked over and poured me a stiff drink. He didn't say anything. He knew there were no words for a moment like this. But the tape was still rolling. Because Brandon didn't just hang up. We had tapped his phone hours ago. We heard him dial a new number immediately. "Vanessa, pick up." I heard my daughter-in-law's sleepy voice. "What is it, Brandon? It is midnight." "Wake up, baby," Brandon shouted, and for the first time he sounded excited. He sounded happy. The old man kicked the bucket. He had a heart attack in the loony bin. "Are you serious?" Vanessa asked, her voice instantly alert. "Are you sure?" "I just got the call." Brandon laughed. "He is gone. And the best part is, he didn't sign the power of attorney, but since he is dead, everything goes to next of kin automatically. No more court battles, no more waiting. The house, the accounts, the land, it is all ours, effective immediately." "Oh my God!" Brandon, Vanessa squealed. "We are rich. We are finally free." I am calling the real estate agent first thing in the morning, Brandon said. We are selling the house as is. I want that cash in my account by Friday. Get your black dress ready, honey. We have a funeral to attend, and we need to look devastated. The recording ended with the click of the disconnect. I sat there in the silence of the study, staring at the wall. The grief I felt wasn't for my life. It was for my son. The boy I raised was dead. He had died a long time ago, and I had just been too blind to see it. The man on the phone was a stranger. A greedy, heartless stranger. I stood up. The trembling in my hands had stopped. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They want a funeral, I said, turning to Lawrence. Let us give them one they will never forget. But it will not be mine. There is something deeply unnatural about attending your own funeral. It goes against the laws of nature and the instincts of the soul. I was sitting in the back of a surveillance van parked 2 blocks away from the funeral home, staring at a bank of monitors. Lawrence sat next to me, his face grim and illuminated by the blue light of the screens. We were watching a live feed from 3 hidden cameras we had planted inside the viewing room earlier that morning. The funeral home Brandon had chosen was the cheapest one in the city. It smelled of mildew and cheap air freshener, even through the screen. The flowers were sparse, mostly carnations, instead of the lilies I had always told him I loved. It was a budget farewell for a father who had given him everything. But the lack of flowers was not what broke my heart. It was the lack of tears. The room was almost empty. Brandon had not called my old friends from the construction union. He had not called the neighbors. The only people there were a few of his colleagues from the law firm, who looked like they were checking their watches every 30 seconds. And standing right next to my closed mahogany casket were my son and his wife. They were supposed to be the grieving family receiving condolences. Instead, they looked like they were waiting for a bus. Vanessa was wearing a black dress that was far too short and tight for a funeral. She was typing furiously on her phone, shielding the screen from the few guests. Brandon stood with his hand on the casket, but he wasn't caressing it with love. He was leaning on it casually, like it was a piece of furniture. I turned up the volume on the directional microphone we had hidden in the flower arrangement. Their voices came through crystal clear. My feet are killing me, Vanessa whispered, putting her phone away. How much longer do we have to stand here, Brandon? I have a nail appointment at 3. Just smile and look sad for another 20 minutes, babe, Brandon replied, his voice low. My boss is watching from the back. I need to look like the devastated son, so he gives me that promotion. Vanessa sighed, rolling her eyes. Did you call the dealership? Did they secure the Porsche? Yeah, I put the deposit down this morning, Brandon said, a smirk playing on his lips. Black on black, just like you wanted. And I booked the flights to the Maldives. First class. We leave on Friday right after the estate funds clear. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My body wasn't even cold in their minds, yet they were already spending my life savings on luxury cars and vacations. They were standing over my empty grave, planning their celebration. You know, Vanessa said, leaning closer to him. It is kind of a relief, isn't it? Not having to deal with him anymore. No more Sunday dinners. No more smelling his old man clothes. Brandon chuckled. It was a dry, heartless sound. You have no idea. I felt like a weight was lifted off my chest the moment that doctor called. He was just a burden, Vanessa. A stubborn old anchor dragging us down. Now we are finally free. He patted the lid of the casket. Thanks for checking out early, Dad. You finally did something useful. I watched as they shared a small secret smile over my supposed corpse. They held hands, not for comfort, but in victory. They thought they were burying a problem. They didn't know they were digging their own graves. I reached out and turned off the monitor. The screen went black, cutting off the image of their smug faces. I sat in the darkness of the van for a long moment. The sadness was gone now. It had been burned away by the white-hot fire of justice. "Are you okay?" Conrad Lawrence asked softly from the shadows. "I am better than okay," I said, my voice steady and hard. "I am ready. Let them have their party, Lawrence. Let them buy their tickets and order their cars. Because tomorrow night at the gala, I am going to cancel everything. Drive the van," I said to the security agent. "We have a resurrection to prepare for." The dirt on my empty grave was not even fresh before the champagne corks started popping in my living room. I sat in the surveillance van, my hands gripping the edge of the console until my knuckles turned white, watching the feed from the cameras we had hidden in the crown molding. My home, the sanctuary where I had raised my son and nursed my dying wife, had been turned into a nightclub. They did not wait a week. They did not even wait a day. They had moved in that very afternoon. I watched on the bedroom camera as Vanessa threw my clothes into black garbage bags. She grabbed my flannel shirts, my work boots, and even my dress blue military uniform and tossed them like they were infected. She told the movers to burn them because she did not want the smell of old man lingering in her new master suite. Seeing my life reduced to trash bags hurt more than the beatings I had taken in the war. It was a complete erasure of my existence. By 7 o'clock, the driveway was full of luxury cars. Brandon had invited the senior partners from the law firm, the investors, and anyone he needed to impress. It was not a wake. It was a coronation. He was strutting around my living room wearing one of my vintage smoking jackets, holding a glass of my best whiskey, acting like the lord of the manor. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. It made me sick. Then the doorbell rang. The room went quiet as Brandon rushed to answer it, adjusting his tie nervously. He had sent an invitation to the chairman of the Falcon Group, a desperate Hail Mary to secure his promotion. He had no idea that the chairman was the man he had thrown out of his office just 48 hours ago. Lawrence walked in. He looked magnificent in a bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair combed back perfectly. He radiated power and wealth. He did not look like the shivering homeless man from the bus. And just as Lawrence predicted, Brandon did not recognize him. People only see what they expect to see. Brandon expected a billionaire, so that is what he saw. He did not look at the eyes. He looked at the suit. "Mr. Chairman," Brandon said, bowing like a servant, his voice dripping with oil. "I am so honored you came. I know the circumstances are tragic with my father passing so suddenly, but he would have wanted us to celebrate life." "You liar," I whispered at the screen. "I wanted you to mourn me, not drink my liquor." Lawrence played his part perfectly. He walked into the center of the room, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "My condolences." "Brandon," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "It is a tragedy to lose a father. He must have been a great man to leave you such a legacy." Brandon laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, he was fine. A bit simple. A laborer, you know. He did not understand the world of high-stakes business like we do. He was happy with his small life. But he served his purpose." I felt a tear roll down my cheek in the dark van. Not of sadness, but of pure, cold rage. He served his purpose. That is all I was to him. A bank account with a pulse. A stepping stone for his ambition. "Enjoy your champagne, Brandon," I said to the monitor, "because it is the last expensive drink you will ever have." Lawrence raised his glass to my son, a predator smiling at his prey. The trap was set, and the mouse had just walked right in. The surveillance monitor flickered with the warm, golden light of the chandelier I had installed 30 years ago, illuminating the face of the man who had ordered my eviction. Brandon was practically vibrating with excitement. He adjusted his silk tie for the 10th time and smoothed down the lapels of his smoking jacket. He looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes, but with none of the innocence Mr. Falcon Brandon exclaimed, rushing forward with his hand extended. "You have no idea what this means to me. Thank you for coming to my humble home during this difficult time." Lawrence took Brandon's hand. He did not squeeze it. He held it just long enough to be polite but loose enough to show dominance. Lawrence was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him like armor. His silver hair was swept back, and his face was clean-shaven. There was not a trace of the homeless man from the bus station. Brandon looked right into the eyes of the man he had thrown into the garbage and saw only a billionaire. It was a testament to how blind greed makes you. You only see the suit, never the soul. "You have a lovely home, Brandon," Lawrence said, his voice deep and smooth. "It has good bones, strong foundations. Your father must have been a man of vision to build something like this." Brandon laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made my fists clench in the darkness of the van. "Oh, the house is all right," Brandon said, waving a hand at the mahogany walls I had sanded myself. "But it is dated. My father was a simple man, Mr. Falcon. He was a laborer. He did not have the taste or the sophistication that we have. He held on to things too long. I plan to gut the interior next month. Open concept, modern, something that reflects my status as a future partner." I watched Lawrence's face carefully. A flicker of anger passed through his eyes so fast that if you blinked, you would miss it. But his smile never wavered. "A simple man," Lawrence repeated, swirling his champagne. "Sometimes simplicity hides great depth." "But you are right, Brandon. The future belongs to those who are willing to make hard choices. I heard about the power of attorney. You acted quickly. That shows initiative." Brandon puffed out his chest, preening like a peacock. "It was a hard decision, sir, but a necessary one. The business world has no room for sentimentality. My father was losing his mind. He was becoming a liability. I did what a leader has to do. I cut the dead weight to save the ship." I felt a tear slide down my cheek in the cold van. Dead weight. That was what my life amounted to in his eyes. All the sacrifices, all the overtime shifts, all the love, just dead weight to be cut loose. Lawrence stepped closer to him, invading his personal space just slightly. "It takes a killer instinct to do that," Lawrence said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Most men are too weak. They let emotion cloud their judgment. But you, Brandon, you remind me of myself when I was younger. Hungry, ruthless, willing to do whatever it takes to get to the top." Brandon's face lit up. He looked like he had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. He didn't hear the trap in Lawrence's words. He didn't hear the judgment. He only heard the praise. "Thank you, sir," Brandon stammered. "I have always admired your ruthless approach to business. I want to be just like you." Lawrence raised his glass. "Then let us drink to it. To the new generation. To the men who know that family is just a word, but power is everything. To power." Brandon echoed, clinking his glass against Lawrence's. He drank the champagne greedily, tilting his head back. He didn't see Lawrence staring at him with the cold, dead eyes of an executioner. He didn't know that the man he wanted to be was the man who was about to destroy him. I sat back in the van and wiped my face. "Enjoy the view from the top, son," I whispered, "because the fall is going to be a long one." The party inside was reaching a fever pitch of self-congratulation, but Lawrence Falcon had seen enough. He stepped out onto the wide stone terrace of the mansion, leaving the sound of popping corks and Brandon's braying laughter behind the heavy glass doors. The night air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stench of greed that filled the room. Arthur, his head of security and personal assistant, stepped out of the shadows to join him. Arthur handed Lawrence a tablet with a glowing digital map of downtown Chicago. The screen displayed the city grid, but with specific lots highlighted in deep crimson. "It is hard to watch," Sir Arthur said, looking through the glass at Brandon, who was now standing on a table making a toast. "He calls his father a peasant while drinking his wine. Does he really have no idea who Conrad Sullivan is?" Lawrence swiped a finger across the screen, zooming in on the financial district. He stopped on the block that housed the Falcon Tower, the very building where Brandon worked, the very building from which he had evicted his father. He has no idea, Lawrence said quietly. Brandon sees a man in flannel and work boots and thinks he sees a failure. He does not understand that in this town, the real money is silent. Conrad didn't just build houses, Arthur. He bought the dirt they stand on. Lawrence tapped the screen. Back in the 1980s, when this district was nothing but abandoned warehouses and mud, Conrad Sullivan took a gamble. He took every penny he made from his contracting business and bought the land. He bought the city block by block. He didn't sell it when the developers came knocking. He leased it. Arthur's eyes widened as he looked at the red zones on the map. Wait, you mean... Yes, Lawrence nodded. I own the building, Arthur. I own the steel and the glass of the Falcon Tower. But the ground underneath it, the foundation that holds it all up, that belongs to Conrad Sullivan. Every month my company writes a check for ground rent to a blind trust, a trust that Conrad set up 30 years ago to ensure his son's future. Lawrence looked back at Brandon, who was now dancing with Vanessa. The irony was Shakespearean. The boy was celebrating his promotion to partner in a firm that sat on his father's land. He was evicting the landlord. He was spitting in the face of the man who literally held the deed to his career. Conrad chose to live simply because he knows the value of $1. Lawrence continued, his voice filled with admiration. He drove an old truck not because he had to, but because he remembered what it was like to walk. He saved that rent money for decades, compounding it, investing it. He is not just a millionaire, Arthur. He is one of the largest landholders in Illinois. And he never told his son, Arthur asked. He wanted Brandon to build his own character, Lawrence said sadly. He wanted him to value work, not inheritance. He failed in that, I suppose. Or maybe Brandon failed him. Lawrence turned off the tablet. The red map faded into black. Let them have their night, Arthur. Let them drink the expensive wine and dream of their yachts. Because when we reveal the truth tomorrow night, Brandon is going to realize he didn't just kick his father out of a house. He kicked the foundation out from under his own life, and the whole structure is about to come crashing down. The party noise from the great hall was just a distant thrumming vibration through the floorboards, but where I was standing, the silence was absolute. I was not hiding in a closet or under a bed. I was standing in the narrow ventilation corridor behind the master library. When I built this house 30 years ago, I installed a safe room and a maintenance passage that ran behind the heavy mahogany bookcases. I never told Brandon about it. I never thought I would need to use it to spy on my own family. The library door creaked open. A beam of light cut across the Persian rug as two figures stumbled into the room. I peered through the decorative grate concealed in the woodwork. It was Vanessa. But the man holding her by the waist was not my son. It was Julian. I recognized him instantly from the company photos Brandon had shown me. Julian was the senior partner Brandon hated the most. The man Brandon called his nemesis. The man who was competing with him for the promotion. They were kissing with a hunger that turned my stomach. Vanessa pushed him back onto the leather sofa, the very sofa where I used to read bedtime stories to Brandon. Did he suspect anything? Julian asked, smoothing back his hair. Vanessa laughed, and it was a sound pure evil. Brandon is clueless. He thinks he is the smartest man in the room, but he is just a puppy begging for a treat. He actually believes I am planning a nursery. She walked over to the desk and poured 2 drinks. I pressed the record button on the small device Lawrence had given me. So what is the timeline? Julian asked, taking the glass. As soon as the house sale clears on Friday, Vanessa said, taking a sip. The money goes into the joint account. I transfer my half to the offshore shell company in the Caymans immediately. Then you initiate the audit at the firm. Julian chuckled darkly. That is brutal. Once the audit hits, Brandon will be liable for the missing client funds. His assets will be frozen. The IRS will come after him for the tax fraud on the house sale. Exactly, Vanessa smiled. He will be broke, disbarred, and probably facing jail time. And by the time he realizes what happened, we will be on a beach in Rio. I leaned my head against the cold brick of the chimney. My son was a bad man. He was greedy and cruel. But listening to this, I almost felt sorry for him. He thought he was the wolf eating the sheep. He didn't realize he was just a pig being fattened for the slaughter by the woman he loved. And what about the old man? Julian asked. Is he really dead? Who cares? Vanessa shrugged. He is out of the way. That is all that matters. He was just a stepping stone, Julian. Just like Brandon is. She walked back to the sofa and pulled Julian down by his tie. I had heard enough. I stopped the recording. My hand was shaking not from fear, but from a cold, hard realization. My son was about to lose everything. His job, his freedom, his wife, and his money. And the tragedy was, he deserved it. I slipped quietly back into the shadows of the secret passage. The air in the tunnel was stale, but it felt cleaner than the air in that library. I made my way back to the exit where Lawrence was waiting. We have the smoking gun, I whispered to the darkness. Now let us go prepare the firing squad. The underground parking garage of the private hospital was supposed to be secure, but I should have known that money can buy keys to any door. I was walking toward the extraction vehicle, my mind focused on the evidence we had gathered, when I heard the scuff of a boot on concrete. It was a sound I had not heard since my days in the jungle 50 years ago. The sound of an ambush. 3 men stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. They were wearing ski masks and dark clothes. They did not ask for my wallet. They did not ask for my watch. They just came at me with the silent, terrifying efficiency of paid muscle. I am 72 years old, but I am still a Marine. When the first man swung a lead pipe at my head, I ducked. The metal clang echoed against the pillar, sending sparks flying. I drove my fist into his throat, and he went down gagging. For a split second, I thought I could win this. I thought I could hold them off until Lawrence's security arrived. But I was wrong. The second man tackled me from behind, slamming me hard into the hood of a parked sedan. The impact knocked the wind out of me. Before I could recover, the third man swung a heavy baseball bat into my side. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. It sounded like a dry branch snapping in winter. My ribs gave way. The pain was blinding white and hot, tearing through my chest like a jagged knife. It stole my breath and dropped me to my knees. I fell to the cold, oil-stained floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. I tried to get up, but another kick landed hard on my stomach. I curled into a ball, protecting my head with my arms. Through the ringing in my ears and the haze of pain, I heard one of them speaking into a phone. Yeah, we found him. You were right, he was sneaking around. No, he is not moving anymore. I realized then that this was not a warning. It was a hit. Vanessa suspected I wasn't really dead. She had sent these men to finish the job to make sure the corpse in the casket matched the lie she had told. If I kept fighting, they would beat me until my heart stopped for real. So I did the hardest thing a soldier can do. I surrendered. I let my body go limp. I slowed my breathing until it was shallow and ragged. I let the blood from my split lip pool on the concrete cheek. I played the part of the broken, dying old man. One of the thugs kicked my leg. I forced myself not to flinch. I forced my muscles to stay loose even though every nerve was screaming. He is done, the man said. Let us go before security shows up. The blonde lady said to make it look like a mugging gone wrong. Take his shoes. They ripped my boots off my feet. They laughed as they walked away, their footsteps echoing into the darkness. I lay there on the freezing concrete, the pain in my ribs pulsing with every beat of my heart. But the fire in my soul was burning hotter than ever. Vanessa wanted me dead. She wanted to erase me. But all she had done was show me that she was not just a thief. She was a killer. And killers do not get mercy. They get justice. I dragged myself toward the elevator. I was broken, but I was still breathing. And as long as I had breath, they were in trouble. The steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the private recovery room. I lay there with my chest wrapped in tight bandages, each breath sending a sharp spike of fire through my broken ribs. Lawrence had posted guards at the main entrance, but my son found a way in. He always found a way when money was the prize. The door did not open with a creak, it slid open silently. Brandon slipped into the room like a shadow. He was not wearing his morning suit anymore. He looked disheveled, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He locked the door behind him and walked to the side of my bed. He did not ask how I was. He did not look at the bruises on my face that his hired thugs had put there. He looked at the machines keeping me stable, and then he looked at the folder in his hands. "You are a hard man to kill, old man," Brandon whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "I paid those guys good money to make it look like an accident. But here you are, still breathing, still in my way." I tried to sit up, but the pain forced me back down. "What do you want, Brandon?" I rasped, my voice dry and weak. "You already think I am dead. You have the house. You have the accounts." "It is not enough," Brandon hissed. He threw the folder onto my chest right over my broken ribs. I flinched, but he didn't care. "I found out about the blind trust, Dad. The land under the Falcon Tower. You hid it well, but Julian found the trail. Even if you are declared dead, the probate for that trust could take years. I do not have years. I have days. I need you to sign this transfer of ownership now, before you officially die." I looked at him with pity. He was frantic. The walls were closing in on him, and he didn't even know it. "I will not sign it," I said, closing my eyes. "Get out." Brandon's hand shot out and grabbed the clear plastic oxygen tube running to my nose. He pinched it shut. My air cut off instantly. My lungs, which were already struggling, began to burn. I gasped, reaching up to claw at his hand, but he was younger and stronger. He leaned his full weight onto my chest, pressing down on the fracture. "Sign the paper." "Dad." He growled, his face inches from mine, twisted into a mask of pure hate. "Sign it, or I will finish what those thugs started right here. I will just tell the nurse you went into distress and I tried to help. Who are they going to believe? The grieving son or the dead man?" Black spots danced in front of my eyes. My heart monitor began to beep faster, a chaotic warning rhythm. I looked into my son's eyes and saw nothing there. No love, no hesitation. He was going to kill me. "Okay," I choked out, tapping his hand. "Okay." He released the tube. I sucked in a greedy breath of air, coughing as oxygen flooded back into my starving lungs. Brandon shoved a pen into my hand. "Make it legible," he ordered. I took the pen. My hand was shaking violently. I looked at the signature line. "Transfer of all Class A holdings to Brandon Sullivan." I pressed the pen to the paper, but I did not sign my name. Not really. When I was a contractor, I had a specific signature I used for invoices under dispute, a signature with a subtle variation. I looped the S in Sullivan backward and added a tiny extra dot after my middle initial. It was a distress signal. In a court of law, a handwriting expert would testify that this signature was made under duress, invalidating the entire document. I signed it. The trap was set. "Here," I whispered, handing the paper back. "Take it. It is everything I have left." Brandon snatched the paper, grinning like a jackal. He blew on the ink to dry it. "Thanks, Dad," he said, tucking the stolen fortune into his jacket. "Do me a favor. Die quickly. The funeral is tomorrow, and it would be really awkward if you showed up." He turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the dark. I watched the door close. He thought he walked out with a kingdom. He didn't know he had just walked out with a confession. I lay back and smiled through the pain. "See you at the party, son." The silence in the hospital room was heavy, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. My hand was shaking slightly, not from age, but from the adrenaline of the signature I had just faked. The screen lit up with a notification. It was from a social media app I rarely used, but kept to see photos of the grandchildren I thought I was going to have. Vanessa was live. I tapped the screen. The video loaded instantly. There she was. My daughter-in-law was sitting in her walk-in closet surrounded by designer bags. She was wearing a black silk robe and using a filter that made her skin look flawless and her eyes look glistening and wet. She looked like a grieving angel. But I knew she was a digital vulture. "Hey guys," she whispered into the camera, wiping away a tear that didn't exist. "I just wanted to come on here and say thank you for all the support. It has been such a hard week. Brandon is devastated. We tried so hard to care for his father. We really did. But the dementia was just too aggressive." I watched in horror as the comments rolled in on the side of the screen. "Stay strong, Queen. You are a saint for trying. Old people can be so toxic. Sending prayers." Vanessa sighed, looking down dramatically. "He attacked us, you know. In his confusion, he got violent. We had to make the hard choice to put him in a facility, and then his heart just gave out. I guess he was just too full of hate. It is a relief, honestly. Now Brandon and I can finally focus on our growing family without fear." She held up a photo to the camera. It was a picture of me taken secretly weeks ago when I was napping in my armchair, with my mouth open, looking frail and old. She had filtered it to make me look gray and sickly. "This is how I want to remember him," she lied. "At peace. Not the angry, confused man he became." I felt a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with my fever. She was not just stealing my money. She was stealing my legacy. She was painting a picture of me as a monster to justify her greed. She was using my name to get likes and validation from strangers while she plotted to spend my life savings. I looked at the IV tube snaking into my arm. It was tethering me to this bed. It was keeping me a patient. It was keeping me a victim. "I am not a victim," I growled to the empty room. I reached over and grabbed the plastic tape holding the needle in place. I ripped it off. The sting was sharp. I grabbed the hub of the needle and pulled. A stream of dark red blood trickled down my arm, dripping onto the white sheets. I didn't care. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My broken ribs screamed in protest. My head spun. The room tilted. But I planted my bare feet on the cold floor and pushed. I stood up. I swayed for a moment, holding onto the IV pole for support. I looked at the phone screen one last time. Vanessa was blowing a kiss to her followers, promising to update them from the funeral tomorrow. "Keep talking, Vanessa," I said to the screen, "because tomorrow you are going to be speechless." I walked to the closet where Lawrence had hidden my clothes. Not the hospital gown, not the old flannel shirts. Hanging there in a garment bag was my tuxedo, the one I wore when I accepted the key to the city 10 years ago. I wiped the blood from my arm. The old man who wanted to be loved was gone. The builder was back, and I had a demolition to schedule. The rain lashed against the windows of the Falcon estate, but inside the guest suite the air was still and heavy with purpose. I stood before the full-length mirror fastening the onyx cufflinks of my tuxedo. I had not worn this suit in 20 years. A tailor on Savile Row had made it for me the year I won the contract for the City Civic Center. It was made of midnight blue wool that felt like armor against my skin. It smelled faintly of cedar and better days. I tightened the black silk bow tie, watching my reflection. The hospital gown was gone. The smell of antiseptic was washed away. The bruises on my cheek from the assault in the parking garage were still there, turning a dark, angry purple, but I did not cover them with makeup. They were my war paint. They were the evidence of my son's betrayal written on my skin. I smoothed the lapels. The pain in my broken ribs was a dull roar, a constant fire in my chest, but I used it. It sharpened my focus. The man looking back at me was not the confused dementia patient Vanessa had mocked on her live stream. He was Conrad Sullivan, the builder, the father, the survivor. I walked down the grand staircase, my footsteps heavy and deliberate on the marble. I entered the library where the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Lawrence was standing by the fireplace reviewing a stack of documents. When he saw me, he stopped. He slowly took off his reading glasses and nodded. "You clean up nice for a dead man," Conrad Lawrence said, a small smile playing on his lips. "You look like you are ready to buy the whole city." "I am not here to buy the city." "Lawrence," I said, adjusting my cuffs, "I am here to take out the trash." A shadow moved in the corner of the room. A tall man with broad shoulders and a face carved from granite stepped into the light. He was wearing a formal police dress uniform, the gold star on his chest gleaming under the chandelier. It was Sheriff Miller. We had served in the same platoon in Vietnam 50 years ago. He was the man who had pulled me out of a burning Jeep in '68, and he was the only man in law enforcement I trusted with my life. "I thought you kicked the bucket," Conrad Miller said, his voice gravelly and warm. "I was getting ready to come arrest your son for murder based on that live stream alone. When Lawrence called me and told me you were alive, I nearly dropped my phone." "It is good to see you, John," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was as iron hard as ever. "I am sorry to drag you into a family dispute." "This is not a dispute," Miller said, his face hardening. "This is a crime scene." Lawrence showed me the files, Conrad. The embezzlement, the assault, the fake medical records. This is a conspiracy. I have a team of deputies waiting in unmarked cars 2 blocks from the gala. We have the warrant signed by a judge who owes me a favor. He pointed to the table where a team of 3 lawyers were organizing stacks of red folders. "These are the indictments," Miller continued. "Fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and thanks to that little stunt with the oxygen tube, attempted murder. We are not just going to stop the party, Conrad. We are going to bury him under the jail." Lawrence handed me a glass of scotch. The amber liquid caught the light. "The guests are arriving at the ballroom," Lawrence said, checking his watch. "Brandon is already there, giving interviews about his tragic loss. He thinks he is the king of the world tonight." I took the glass. The pain in my ribs throbbed, but my hand was steady. "Let him enjoy the first hour," I said. "Let him get comfortable on the throne. Because when I walk through those doors, I want him to fall from the highest height possible." I finished the drink in one swallow. The burn was grounding. "Let us go, gentlemen," I said, opening the heavy oak doors. "I do not want to be late for my own funeral." The crystal ballroom of the Falcon Tower was vibrating with the energy of 1,000 lies and $1 million worth of champagne. Brandon stood in the center of the room under the massive chandeliers that looked like frozen fireworks, holding court with the senior partners. He was high on adrenaline and victory. He had spent the last hour accepting condolences with a practiced solemn nod while mentally calculating the resale value of my estate. He felt untouchable. He felt like the king of Chicago. A waiter materialized out of the crowd, a young man with a blank face holding a small black velvet box on a silver tray. He bowed slightly to Brandon. "Mr. Sullivan," the waiter said, his voice barely audible over the jazz band. "A courier just delivered this for you. He said it was urgent. A personal gift from a well-wisher." Brandon's eyes lit up. He assumed it was a congratulatory gift from a client, or perhaps a signing bonus from the firm. He took the box. It was heavy and wrapped in an expensive silk ribbon. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Brandon said to the partners, flashing a charming smile. "It seems my reputation precedes me." He stepped away from the circle, moving toward a quieter alcove near the ice sculpture of a swan. He wanted to savor this moment alone. He untied the ribbon, his fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. He lifted the heavy lid, expecting to see the glint of a gold watch, or perhaps the keys to a new car. What he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Resting on the black satin lining was a cheap plastic pregnancy test. It was the kind you buy at a gas station for $5. Next to it was a glossy ultrasound photo. But something was wrong. Across the black and white image of the fetus, someone had stamped a word in bright red ink. Prop. There was a small note card tucked into the lid. Brandon picked it up. His hands, which had been so steady a moment ago, began to shake violently. The note was handwritten in elegant script. Item returned to the costume department. The show is over, Brandon. Check the receipt. Brandon stared at the box. The world around him seemed to tilt on its axis. The jazz music warped into a hideous screeching noise. He looked at the pregnancy test. He looked at the ultrasound. He remembered the day Vanessa showed him the picture. She had been so happy. She had cried. But she never let him come to the appointments. She always had an excuse. The doctor was busy. It was a women-only clinic. She was too sick for visitors. He looked up from the box, his eyes scanning the crowded ballroom with a frantic desperation. He found Vanessa. She was standing near the bar, laughing. She was wearing a tight black dress that showed off her small bump. But now that he looked at it, really looked at it, it seemed stiff, unnatural. Standing next to her was Julian, Brandon's rival. Julian was leaning in close, whispering something in her ear that made Vanessa throw her head back in delight. Julian's hand was resting on the small of her back. It was intimate. Too intimate. A sick realization clawed its way up Brandon's throat. The baby. The nausea. The cravings. Was it all a script? Was he just an actor in a play he didn't know he was starring in? If the baby was a lie, then the marriage was a lie. And if the marriage was a lie, then the plan to sell the house was not about their future. It was about his destruction. He felt the walls of the ballroom closing in. The air felt thin. He clutched the velvet box so hard, the plastic test inside cracked with a sharp snap. He took a step toward Vanessa, his face twisting into a mask of confusion and rising fury. He needed to know. He needed to touch that stomach and feel if it was flesh or if it was just cold silicone. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a forest of terror. The string quartet played a waltz that was too cheerful for a funeral reception, but perfect for a bank robbery. The Crystal Ballroom was packed to capacity with the city's elite. Men in tuxedos and women in diamonds moved like sharks in a tank of expensive gin. They were not here to mourn Conrad Sullivan. They were here to be seen. They were here to drink the free champagne and gossip about who would get the corner office now that the scandal was over. In the center of this golden, swirling world stood Vanessa. She was a masterpiece of deception. Her black gown was cut low enough to be daring, but high enough to be respectful. She kept one hand protectively over her stomach, over the silicone lie strapped to her body. She accepted condolences with a brave, tragic smile that said she was broken but surviving. She tilted her head just so, letting the light catch the single tear she had carefully placed on her cheek. She was playing the role of the century, the grieving widow-to-be, and the mother of the future heir. Brandon stood a few feet away, watching her. The velvet box in his pocket felt like a burning coal against his leg. He was sweating. It was a cold, clammy sweat that made his shirt stick to his back. He watched Julian whisper something to Vanessa. He watched her laugh, a sound that was too loud and too happy for a woman whose father-in-law had just died. He looked at the woman he married, and for the first time he did not see a wife. He saw a stranger wearing a mask. He wanted to run over and rip the dress off her to expose the plastic belly, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed by the crowd. He had to smile. He had to shake hands. He was trapped in his own performance, forced to play the grieving son, while his world crumbled inside his pocket. Then the heavy oak doors of the ballroom began to move. They were 12 feet tall, carved with the history of the company, my company. They swung shut with a deep, booming sound that echoed over the music. The click of the magnetic locks engaging was soft, but to my ears listening from the other side, it sounded like the gate of a prison slamming shut. The air in the room seemed to change instantly. The flow of fresh air was cut off, replacing the scent of flowers with the smell of recycled ambition and nervous sweat. The chatter died down slightly. A hush fell over the crowd, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. They were waiting for the speeches. They were waiting for the announcement of the new partners. They were waiting for Brandon to claim his prize. They did not know they were standing in a courtroom. They did not know that the doors were not locked to keep the public out, but to keep the guilty in. The waiters stopped serving. The music faded to a stop. The spotlight turned toward the stage. The trap was sealed. The stage was set, and the silence that filled the room was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb ticking down to zero. The spotlight cut through the darkness of the ballroom, finding Lawrence Falcon standing at the podium, like a judge presiding over a high court. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch until the clinking of silverware stopped, and every eye in the room was fixed on him. He gripped the sides of the wooden lectern, his knuckles white not from nerves, but from the intensity of the moment. Brandon stood near the front row, a glass of champagne in his hand, a smug smile plastered on his face, waiting for the praise he believed he deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lawrence began, his voice deep and resonating through the speakers. "We often talk about value in this room. We talk about assets. We talk about net worth. But 2 days ago, I learned a lesson about value that no spreadsheet could ever teach me." He paused, looking directly at the table where the senior partners sat. "I decided to conduct a social experiment," Lawrence continued. "I dressed myself in rags. I put dirt on my face. I walked into this very city without a penny in my pocket. I wanted to see who would treat a human being with dignity when there was no profit to be made. I took a public bus. It was freezing cold. Most people looked away. But one man sat next to me. He shared his warmth. He treated me like an equal. I saw Brandon frown slightly. He shifted his weight. The story sounded familiar, but he pushed the thought away. It was impossible. "This man," Lawrence said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "took me to see his son. He was so proud of this boy. He wanted to introduce me to the successful lawyer he had raised. We went to a beautiful office in this very building. And do you know what happened? The room was deathly quiet. You could hear a pin drop. The son did not see a human being," Lawrence thundered. "He saw a stain on his carpet. He saw a liability. He called security. He threw his own father and a helpless old man into the garbage elevator. He mocked my clothes. He laughed at my poverty. He even laughed at the watch on my wrist, claiming it was a fake, because a bum could never own a masterpiece." The color drained from Brandon's face instantly. It happened so fast, it looked like the blood had been sucked out of him by a vacuum. His mouth fell open. The glass of champagne tilted in his hand, spilling expensive vintage onto his polished shoes, but he didn't even notice. He was staring at Lawrence's wrist. Lawrence raised his hand and pulled back the cuff of his tuxedo. The lights caught the gold and sapphire of the Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime. The same watch. The watch Brandon had sneered at. Brandon's knees buckled. He grabbed the back of a chair to stay upright. The room began to spin. The homeless man. The chairman. They were the same person. He had thrown the owner of the company out of the building. He had insulted the most powerful man in Chicago. Lawrence leaned into the microphone, his eyes locking onto Brandon with the force of a weapon. "That son is in this room tonight," Lawrence said, his voice echoing like a judgment from God. "He is standing right there." Lawrence raised a long, steady finger and pointed straight at Brandon. The spotlight swung around, blinding Brandon in a wash of white light. He stood there exposed and trembling, the champagne dripping from his hand, the center of 500 staring eyes. "Mr. Brandon Sullivan," Lawrence said, cold as ice. "You failed the test, and now class is dismissed." The echo of Lawrence's accusation was still bouncing off the crystal chandeliers when the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. The sound was not like a door opening. It was like a thunderclap announcing a storm. Every head in the room turned. The jazz band fell silent. The waiters froze. I stood in the doorway, framed by the golden light of the hallway. I was not the frail old man in the hospital gown anymore. I was wearing my midnight blue tuxedo, the silk lapels gleaming under the lights. The bruises on my cheek from the parking garage attack were dark and ugly, but I wore them like medals of war. Flanking me on either side were 6 agents in blue windbreakers with the yellow letters FBI emblazoned on their chests. Behind them was Sheriff Miller, his hand resting on his holster. A collective gasp swept through the room like a sudden wind. A woman near the front dropped her wine glass, and it shattered on the floor, a sharp sound that punctuated the shock. Dad, Brandon whispered. His voice was trembling so hard, the microphone on his lapel picked it up, broadcasting his fear to the entire room. "You are dead. I have the death certificate. You are a ghost." I did not answer him. I began to walk. I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me as if I were on fire. I looked at the faces of the people who had come to drink my champagne and celebrate my demise. I saw shock. I saw fear. I saw respect. I walked past Vanessa. She was clutching her fake stomach, her face a mask of pure terror. She took a step back, tripping over her own gown. She looked like she wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The exits were blocked by federal agents. I reached the stage. Lawrence stepped aside, handing me the microphone with a nod of solemn victory. I took it. The weight of it felt good in my hand. I looked down at my son. He was shaking his eyes wide and wet with tears of panic. He looked small. He looked like a child who had been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Only the jar was a multi-million-dollar estate. "I am sorry to disappoint you, Brandon," I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "But the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." I touched the bandage on my neck, hidden beneath my collar. "You tried to silence me with a power of attorney. You tried to erase me with a fake diagnosis. You even tried to kill me in a hospital bed. But you forgot one thing, son. You cannot kill the foundation without bringing down the whole house." I looked out at the silent crowd. "You all think Brandon Sullivan is a partner in this firm. You think he is a success. But he is a tenant, and his lease has just expired." I pointed to the floor. "My name is Conrad Sullivan. I am not just a retired contractor. I am the sole owner of the Sullivan Land Trust. I own the ground this tower stands on. I own the walls you are standing in. And I own the company you work for." Brandon let out a strangled sob. "No. That is impossible. You are just a bricklayer." I smiled a cold, hard smile. "I laid the bricks, Brandon. And now I am here to tear them down. You are trespassing on my property, and I am evicting you. Right now." You might think that taking a man's fortune is the ultimate punishment, but you would be wrong. Money is just paper. To truly break a man who has lost his soul, you have to take away his excuses. I stood on that stage looking down at Brandon, who was still gasping for air, like a fish thrown onto the dock. He was clutching his chest, trying to process the fact that he was trespassing on his own father's land. But I was not done. I had one more brick to pull from the wall. "You told yourself it was necessary." "Brandon," I said, my voice soft, but amplified to every corner of the silent room. "You told yourself you were stealing my home to provide for your son. You used that unborn child as a shield to hide your greed. You used him to guilt me into signing my life away. I signaled to the technician in the booth. The massive projection screen behind me, which had been displaying the company logo, flickered and changed. A gasping murmur rippled through the crowd. It was not a financial chart. It was a medical document, magnified 100 times. The header read, Miami-Dade Surgical Center. The patient name was Vanessa Sullivan. The procedure date was 5 years ago. Brandon squinted at the screen, his eyes swimming with confusion. He read the words out loud, his voice cracking. Total abdominal hysterectomy. He stopped. He blinked. He looked at the words again, trying to make them mean something else, trying to arrange the letters into a reality where he was still a father. But the medical terminology was cold and absolute. That means she cannot carry a child. Brandon, I said, there is no baby. There never was a baby. The ultrasound you saw was downloaded from the internet. The symptoms were an act. You sold your father for a ghost. Vanessa let out a shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. Turn it off, she screamed, lunging toward the stage. It is a fake. He forged it. Do not listen to him, Brandon. But Brandon was not listening to her. He was staring at her stomach. He was staring at this bump he had kissed every night for months. He was staring at the future he had killed me for. He took a step toward her. His face was a landscape of devastation. Vanessa, he whispered, tell me it is not true. Vanessa stumbled back, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Brandon, I can explain. We needed the leverage. We needed him to sign. I did it for us. Brandon reached out. His hand was shaking. He did not go for her face or her hands. He reached for her stomach. Vanessa tried to swat his hand away, but he was faster. He grabbed the fabric of her black dress and pulled. There was no warmth of human skin. There was no resistance of muscle. The fabric slipped, revealing the top edge of a pale silicone pad strapped tightly to her waist. The room went completely silent. The horror of the deception sucked the air out of the ballroom. Brandon stared at the plastic prosthetic. He poked it. It dented inward like a hollow doll. He looked up at Vanessa, and then he looked at me. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had become a monster for nothing. He had evicted his father for a lie. He had destroyed his soul for a piece of plastic. No, Brandon wailed. It was a sound of pure agony, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He fell to his knees, his expensive tuxedo pants hitting the floor with a thud. He buried his face in his hands and wept. Not the fake tears of the funeral, but the ugly, raw tears of a man who looks in the mirror and sees nothing but ruin. I watched him fall. I felt no joy, only a deep, hollow sadness. The trap was sprung, and it had caught a fool. The image of the medical records faded to black, leaving a void on the giant screen that felt heavy with impending doom. Brandon was still on his knees, staring at the floor, his mind shattered by the revelation of the fake pregnancy. He looked like a man who had reached the bottom of the well, but I had one more bucket of cold water to pour. I nodded to the technician one last time. The screen flickered to life again. This time it was a video. The grain was high and the lighting was dim, but the faces were unmistakable. It was the footage from my own library recorded just hours ago while the party raged outside. The audio crackled through the ballroom speakers, amplified so that every whisper sounded like a shout. There was Vanessa sitting on my leather sofa, and there next to her, pouring a drink with a casual familiarity, was Julian, Brandon's rival, the man he hated most in the world. The crowd gasped as they watched Julian pull Vanessa close. They watched as she kissed him with a passion she had never shown her husband. But it was the words that cut the deepest. The voice of the woman who had just pledged eternal love to Brandon filled the room. Brandon is clueless. Vanessa's recorded voice sneered. He thinks he is a wolf, but he is just a puppy begging for a treat. We take the money, we frame him for the fraud, and we leave him to rot in prison while we enjoy Rio. I watched Brandon. He looked up at the screen, his eyes dead and hollow. He saw his wife in the arms of his enemy. He heard her plan to frame him. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just financial. It was personal. It was intimate. He looked over at the VIP table where Julian had been sitting. The chair was empty. Julian had slipped out the side door the moment the video started, leaving Vanessa to face the fire alone. Vanessa stood frozen for a second, her face illuminated by the giant projection of her own treachery. The mask of the grieving widow fell away completely. In its place was the face of a cornered animal. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Brandon, who was looking at her with a mixture of hatred and nausea. She realized the game was not just over, it was incinerated. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat. "Stop it! It is a deepfake! It is AI!" She looked around frantically for a way to stop the truth. She saw the projector unit sitting on a low table at the edge of the stage. A madness took over her. She hiked up her designer gown and lunged toward the screen. She grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from a banquet table, swinging it like a club. "I will kill you," she screamed, not at me, but at her own image on the wall. She smashed the candelabra into the screen, tearing the fabric. She struck it again and again, screaming incoherent curses, trying to physically destroy the evidence of her sins. She looked deranged, her hair flying wild, her makeup smeared. "Security," I said calmly into the microphone. Two large agents moved in from the shadows. They did not run. They moved with the heavy inevitability of justice. Vanessa tried to swing the brass weapon at them, but one of the agents caught her wrist in midair. He twisted it effortlessly, and the candelabra clattered to the floor. "Get your hands off me!" she spat, kicking and thrashing. "Do you know who I am? I am a victim." "You are under arrest, madam," the agent said, spinning her around and snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. They dragged her kicking and screaming off the stage. She passed right by Brandon. She didn't look at him. She was still shouting about her rights, about her money, about how unfair it was that she had lost. Brandon watched her go. He didn't move to help her. He didn't say a word. He just watched the woman he had destroyed his family for get hauled away like a common criminal. The video loop on the torn screen behind him played on, showing the kiss over and over again, a permanent reminder of his stupidity. The screams of my daughter-in-law faded down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying because it was filled with the truth. Brandon stood alone in the center of the ballroom. The guests who had been drinking his champagne 5 minutes ago had backed away, leaving a wide, empty circle around him, as if he were carrying a contagious disease. He looked small. He looked like a man who had woken up from a dream to find himself in a nightmare. Lawrence stepped forward to the edge of the stage. He did not look angry anymore. He looked disappointed, which is a far heavier burden for a son to bear. He held up a thick blue file folder, the same one he had shown me in the car. He signaled the technician, and the projection screen changed one last time. The video of the affair was replaced by something far colder, but equally damning. It was a spreadsheet. It was a forensic accounting of the Falcon Group's escrow accounts for the last 18 months. Rows and rows of numbers scrolled down the screen like a waterfall of red ink. Every transaction was highlighted. Every transfer was tracked. "You wanted to be a partner," Brandon Lawrence said, his voice calm and level. "You wanted a seat at the big table. But you forgot the first rule of business. You do not steal from the hand that feeds you." The screen zoomed in on a series of wire transfers. $50,000 to a sports betting site in Nevada. $20,000 to a luxury car dealership. $10,000 to a jewelry store. All of it paid for with money that belonged to widows and orphans, money held in trust by the firm. "This is the client ledger," Lawrence explained, pointing to the evidence. You have been siphoning funds to cover your gambling debts and to buy the illusion of success you paraded in front of your father. You stole over $2 million, Brandon. You did not just rob the company. You robbed the people who trusted you to protect their future. Brandon shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. It was a loan, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. I was going to pay it back. Once the house sold. Once I got the promotion. It was just a bridge loan. It is called embezzlement. Lawrence corrected him sharp as a whip. And it is a federal crime. Sheriff Miller stepped out from the shadows behind me. He walked down the steps of the stage, his heavy boots thudding on the wood. He walked straight up to Brandon. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Brandon Sullivan Miller said, his voice booming through the silent room. I have a warrant here for your arrest. The charges are grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Brandon looked at the cuffs. He looked at me standing on the stage, alive and whole. He looked at Lawrence, the billionaire he had insulted. He looked at the empty spot where his wife used to be. The fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped. He held out his wrists. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of a door slamming on a life that could have been great. You have the right to remain silent, Miller said, reciting the words we both knew by heart. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Brandon looked up at me as Miller began to lead him away. His eyes were filled with tears. Dad, he whispered, help me. I looked at my son. I saw the little boy I had carried on my shoulders. I saw the teenager I had taught to drive, but I also saw the man who had tried to kill me for a paycheck. I did help you, son, I said softly into the microphone, my voice breaking just a little. I stopped you before you could lose your soul completely. Now you have to pay the bill. I watched as the police led him out past the staring crowd. He walked with his head down, a broken man in a stolen suit, leaving behind a legacy of shame. The ballroom was silent, save for the distant siren that was coming to take him home. The sirens had faded into the night, carrying my son to his reckoning, but the ballroom was not entirely empty. A group of men in expensive suits remained standing near the bar, like a pack of wolves that had lost their alpha, but still wanted to eat. They were the investors, the shady developers Brandon had promised to sell my land to. One of them, a tall man with a face like a clenched fist, stepped forward. He was holding a piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. It was the transfer of ownership document Brandon had forced me to sign in the hospital room while he pinched my oxygen tube. Not so fast, Mr. Sullivan, the man said, his voice dripping with corporate malice. Your son may be going to jail, but a deal is a deal. We have a signed contract here. It says you transferred all Class A holdings to the Falcon Group, which is now under our receivership. We own the land this tower sits on. We own your house, and we intend to enforce this. He slapped the paper onto the table next to me. The ink was barely dry. It looked official. It looked like defeat. Lawrence stepped forward, ready to call his lawyers, but I held up a hand. I had this. I had been preparing for this moment since I was 20 years old, working on job sites where dishonest foremen tried to cheat us out of our wages. I walked over to the table and looked down at the paper. I looked at the signature I had scrawled while gasping for air. You might want to look closer at that signature, I said, my voice calm and steady. The investor sneered. It is your name. We already had a handwriting expert compare it to your public records. It is a match. It is a match for my name, I agreed. But it is not my signature. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a magnifying glass that I used for reading blueprints. I handed it to the man. Look at the S in Sullivan, I instructed. And look at the period after my middle initial. The man frowned, but he leaned in. He squinted through the glass. You see that loop, I asked. The top of the S is curved backward. And there are 2 dots after the initial, not one. So what? The man snapped. You were old and shaky. It means nothing. It means everything, I said, leaning in close so he could see the fire in my eyes. In the construction trade back in the 70s, we had a code. When you were forced to sign a safety inspection under duress, or when a mobster tried to make you sign a racket contract, you used the distress mark. That backward loop and that double dot is a legally recognized declaration of coercion. It means I signed that paper while my life was in danger. I stood up straight and buttoned my jacket. That is not a contract, sir. That is a crime scene evidence. It proves my son tried to murder me to get that ink on the page. And under state law, any document signed during the commission of a felony is automatically null and void. The color drained from the investor's face. He looked at the paper as if it had turned into a poisonous snake. He knew I was right. He knew that if he tried to take this to court, a judge would not only throw it out, but would likely investigate him for conspiracy. He crumpled the paper in his fist. This isn't over, he hissed. I laughed, a deep, rich sound of absolute victory. Oh, it is over, I said, pointing to the door. You bet on the wrong horse. And now the stable is closed. Get out of my building before I have the sheriff add you to the booking sheet downtown. The wolves looked at each other, then at the federal agents standing by the wall. They turned and fled, leaving the crumpled paper on the table. I picked it up. I smoothed it out. I ripped it in half and then in half again. I let the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. My home was safe. My legacy was safe. The war was finally won. The handcuffs were already digging into his wrists, but desperation gave my son a frantic, slippery strength. Just as Sheriff Miller tried to guide him toward the exit, Brandon twisted his body. He broke free from the grip, not to run toward the door, but to run toward me. He collapsed onto the polished marble floor, sliding the last few feet until he was kneeling at my feet. He looked up at me and his face was unrecognizable. The arrogance was gone. The sneer was gone. All that was left was a terrified child, terrified of the dark. He wrapped his arms around my legs, burying his face in the fabric of the tuxedo I had worn to bury his mother. He was sobbing so hard his shoulders shook violently, staining my trousers with his tears and snot. Dad, please, he wailed, his voice high and thin. You cannot let them take me. I am your boy. I am your Brandon. Look at me. Remember when we went fishing at the lake? Remember when you taught me to ride a bike? You cannot send your own son to prison. I looked down at the top of his head. I saw the expensive haircut he had paid for with stolen money. I felt the weight of him clinging to me. But inside my chest, where my heart used to beat for him, there was only a vast, frozen silence. I searched for pity. I searched for anger. I searched for even a flicker of the love that had defined my life for 30 years. But the well was dry. It wasn't me, Dad, Brandon cried, tightening his grip. It was Vanessa. She made me do it. She is a witch, Dad. She manipulated me. She told me you were sick. She told me we had to do it for the baby. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear. I was just trying to be a good husband. She is the monster here, not me. I am a victim just like you. I listened to him throw his wife under the bus. The woman he had conspired with. The woman he had kissed while they planned my destruction. He was willing to sacrifice anyone to save his own skin. It was the final proof I needed. The corruption in him went down to the bone. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, reaching for Brandon's shoulder, but I held up a hand. I wanted one last moment. Get up, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was colder than the grave he had dug for me. Brandon looked up, hope flickering in his wet eyes. He thought he had broken me. He thought the old soft Conrad was back. He scrambled to his knees. Dad, he breathed. Thank you. I knew you would understand. We can fix this. We can testify against her. I took a step back, breaking his contact with me. I looked at him with the same detached interest I would show a stranger on the street. I do not understand you, I said, and I do not know you. The Brandon I raised would have taken responsibility. The Brandon I raised would have protected his family, not sold them. That boy died a long time ago. I signaled to the sheriff. Take him away, John, I said, turning my back on the pleading man on the floor. But Dad Brandon screamed as Miller hauled him up. I am your son. You have to forgive me. It is your job. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. I already forgave my son, I said quietly. I forgave him the day he died. You are just the thief who stole his name. I walked away toward Lawrence, leaving the echoes of his screaming behind me. I did not look back. I had a building to run and a life to reclaim, and for the first time in a long time I was free. The sheriff had a firm grip on Brandon's arm, ready to lead him toward the squad car, but I raised my hand one last time. There was one final piece of business that needed to be concluded before the books could be closed on this tragedy. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I stepped closer to the man who used to be my son. He was slumped over, broken and weeping, but I needed him to hear this. I needed the whole city to hear this. Wait, John, I said to the sheriff. I want everyone to witness this. I turned to the silent crowd of partners and investors. They were watching with a mixture of awe and fear. I stood tall, adjusting my cufflinks. Brandon Sullivan, I said, my voice projecting clear and cold to the back of the room. Effective immediately, your employment with the Falcon Group is terminated for cause. You are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your pension. You are stripped of your stock options. You leave this company with nothing but the criminal record you earned today. Brandon sobbed a wet, pathetic sound. But I wasn't done. And as for my personal estate, I continued, my eyes locking onto his. You wanted to inherit my fortune so badly, you were willing to stop my heart to get it. Well, let me make this very clear. Tonight I am instructing my lawyers to draft a new will. Every single penny I have, every acre of land, every brick of this building will be placed into a charitable trust. I leaned in close so he could smell the scotch on my breath. It is going to the homeless shelter downtown Brandon. The same shelter you tried to send me to. The money you killed for will be used to buy soup and blankets for the people you called trash. You will never see a dime of it. You are disinherited. You are disowned. You are no longer a Sullivan. Brandon let out a low moan, his knees buckling under the weight of his erased future. Sheriff, I said, stepping back, he is all yours, but do not let him walk out of here. I looked at the security guards standing by the door, the same guards who had watched Brandon throw me out days ago. Do you remember how he removed me from this building? I asked them. Do you remember how he told you to drag me like a sack of garbage? The guards nodded, their faces grim. Good, I said, pointing at Brandon. Show him the same courtesy. Drag him out. The guards moved in. They did not be gentle. They grabbed Brandon by the arms and the back of his expensive jacket. They lifted him off his feet. He kicked and screamed, his polished shoes scraping uselessly against the marble floor. No, let me walk, have some dignity, he screamed. You lost your dignity when you betrayed your blood, I said. They dragged him down the long center aisle. His heels left black scuff marks on the floor. His tuxedo bunched up around his neck. He looked ridiculous. He looked small. It was a perfect mirror of the night he had tossed me into the cold. The guests parted like the Red Sea, watching in silence as the former golden boy was hauled out like a bag of refuse. I watched until the heavy doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his wails. The silence that followed was not empty. It was clean. It was the feeling of a heavy burden finally being set down. I looked at Lawrence. I looked at the sheriff. I took a deep breath of the air in my own building. It tasted sweet. The cancer was cut out. The healing could finally begin. The last guest had departed, leaving the Falcon Tower in a silence that felt deeper than the grave. The janitors were downstairs sweeping up the confetti and the shattered glass. But up here in the corner office, the air was still. I sat in the high-back leather chair, the same chair Brandon had sat in when he ordered his security guards to throw me out. It felt too big for me now, or maybe I just felt small. The weight of the night was pressing down on my shoulders, heavier than any load of bricks I had ever carried. On the mahogany desk in front of me sat a silver picture frame. It was a photo taken last Christmas. In it, Brandon was laughing, his arm draped over my shoulder, and Vanessa was smiling that bright, dazzling smile that I now knew was practiced in a mirror. We looked like the perfect American family. We looked like a legacy. But as I stared at it under the harsh light of the desk lamp, I saw the truth. I saw the emptiness in Brandon's eyes. I saw the tightness in Vanessa's jaw. It was not a memory. It was a prop. Just like the ultrasound. Just like the love they claimed to have for me. I reached out and picked up the frame. My hands were steady now, the adrenaline of the confrontation replaced by a numb, hollow ache. I flipped the latches on the back and removed the photo. The glossy paper felt cold. I held it for a long moment, tracing the face of the little boy I used to know. I wanted to mourn him. I wanted to cry for the child who used to run into my arms when I came home from work dusty and tired. But that child was gone. He had been consumed by the man who wanted me dead. I took a heavy brass lighter from the drawer. It was an antique, a gift from my late wife. I flicked the wheel and a small orange flame danced in the quiet room. I held the fire to the corner of the photograph. The paper caught instantly. I watched as the flame crawled up the image, curling the edges, turning the bright colors into black, crinkled ash. I dropped the burning photo into the metal wastebasket. I watched the faces of my son and his wife distort and melt away. The fire consumed their smiles. It consumed their lies. It turned the false future they had promised me into smoke that drifted up toward the ventilation vent. The smell of burning chemical paper filled the room, a sharp, acrid scent that stung my nose. It was the smell of a cleansing fire. I let it burn until there was nothing left but gray dust. Then I picked up the phone. It was 2 a.m, but I knew my lawyer would answer. He did on the first ring. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice raspy but firm. "I am sorry to wake you, but I have new instructions for the estate." "Go ahead," Conrad Henderson said, his voice alert. "I want you to liquidate the portfolio," I said, looking at the pile of ash in the bin. "The trust fund I set up for Brandon. The stocks, the bonds, the offshore accounts he was trying to steal. Everything." "Liquidation," Henderson repeated. "And where should I direct the funds, sir?" "I want you to open a new foundation," I said. "Call it the Sullivan Home for the Forgotten. I want every penny of that inheritance to go toward building high-quality housing for the elderly who have no family. I want them to have warm beds. I want them to have good food. I want them to have the dignity that my son tried to take from me." There was a pause on the line. "That is a lot of money, Conrad. That is a fortune." "I know," I said. "Brandon wanted to use it to buy sports cars and islands. He wanted to use it to escape his life. I am going to use it to save lives. I want the papers drawn up by morning. And Henderson, make sure there is a clause. No one with the last name of Sullivan other than myself can ever touch a dime of it." I hung up the phone. I swiveled the chair around to look out at the city of Chicago. The lights were twinkling below me, a grid of millions of souls. Somewhere out there in a cold jail cell, my son was sleeping on a metal cot. He had nothing, but the money he coveted was going to warm the people he despised. I closed my eyes. I was alone in the empty office. I had no wife. I had no son. But as the smoke cleared from the room, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The rot was gone. The foundation was clean. and tomorrow I would start building again. The morning mist hung low over the water, swirling like ghosts before the sun burned them away. We were out on the boat by 5 a.m., just like the old days before the money and the towers and the betrayal complicated everything. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a welcome change from the antiseptic stench of the hospital and the stale perfume of the courtroom. I sat in the stern of the small aluminum fishing boat, holding my rod with a loose, comfortable grip. My ribs had finally healed, leaving only a dull ache when the weather turned cold. Lawrence sat in the bow wearing a thick wool sweater and a bucket hat that looked ridiculous on a billionaire, but perfect for a friend. He was struggling to untangle his line, muttering soft curses under his breath. It was the first time I had seen him look truly relaxed in years. It had been 3 months since the gala, 3 months since the gavel came down. The silence of the lake was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the distant call of a loon. It was peaceful. It was clean. Miles away in a place that knew no peace, my son was starting his shift. I didn't need to see it to know what it looked like. I knew the schedule of the Stateville Correctional Center better than I wanted to. Right now, Brandon was standing in the industrial scullery. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that chafed his skin. His hands, the hands that had once signed fraudulent checks and held glasses of expensive champagne, were now submerged in lukewarm, greasy water. He was scrubbing metal trays, scraping off the hardened remains of oatmeal and beans. There was no corner office for him anymore. There was no view of the skyline. There was only the gray wall of the kitchen and the shouting of the guards. He was probably looking at his reflection in the dirty water, seeing the ghost of the man who thought he was a king. He was washing the dishes of the men he would have more crossed the street to avoid 3 months ago. It was a poetic justice that tasted bitter but necessary. Lawrence finally freed his hook and cast his line out. The lure hit the water with a soft plop. "Do you miss him, Conrad?" Lawrence asked quietly, without turning around. I watched my red and white bobber dancing on the ripples. It was a question I had asked myself 100 times in the dark of the night. Did I miss the son I raised? Or did I mourn the stranger who tried to kill me? I miss who he was, I said, my voice raspy with the morning air. I miss the little boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee, but I do not miss the man who looked me in the eye and wished me dead. That man was a stranger, Lawrence, and you do not miss strangers. Lawrence nodded slowly, reeling in a little slack. Some people say you were too hard on him, Conrad. They say you should have left him a little something. Maybe a trust fund. Maybe a safety net. After all, he is your blood. I tightened my grip on the rod. I thought about the oxygen tube being pinched. I thought about the fake pregnancy. I thought about the elderly people who would have been thrown out on the street if Brandon had succeeded in selling my land. A safety net is for people who fall, I said, looking out at the horizon. It is not for people who push others off the ledge. If I had given him money, I would have been funding his next crime. I would have been an accomplice to his corruption. I reeled in my line, checking the bait. You know, Lawrence, I continued, for a long time I thought love meant giving him everything he wanted. I thought forgiveness was a virtue. But I learned a hard lesson on that hospital bed. I looked at Lawrence, my eyes clear and steady. Being merciful to the wicked is being cruel to oneself. Lawrence looked at me and then he smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was filled with understanding. You are right, my friend, he said. You saved yourself, Conrad. And in doing so, you saved the memory of the father you really are. Suddenly my rod bent double. The line hissed as it tore through the water. I think we got one, I shouted, the sadness vanishing in the thrill of the catch. I began to reel it in. The fight was on. But this time it was a fair fight. And as the sun finally broke through the mist, flooding the lake with golden light, I knew that I was going to be okay. The storm was over. The water was calm. And I was finally home. The story of Conrad and Brandon teaches us a brutal but necessary truth about human nature. Money does not change people, it simply unmasks them. Brandon believed that inheritance was a right rather than a privilege, and in his blind pursuit of unearned wealth, he lost the only true treasure he possessed, which was a father's unconditional love. We often believe that family deserves infinite chances, but Conrad showed us that true dignity means knowing when to cut the cord. Enabling a monster is not love, it is self-destruction. The most painful lesson of all is that sometimes you must let go of the people you love to protect the soul you have left, because being merciful to the cruel is just being cruel to yourself. If you were in Conrad's shoes, would you have forgiven Brandon, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.